In this video, I'll demonstrate how to deploy vCenter 8. And the first step is I need to make sure that I have a DNS server entry for vCenter. So in my lab environment, I have a Windows server running that's handling DNS for me. And so on that Windows Server 2016 is what I'm actually running. I'm going to go to Server Manager, and I'll click on DNS here. And from there, I'll right-click on the name of my server, and I'll start DNS Manager. And so I need to make sure that I have a record created in my forward lookup zone for my vCenter server appliance. So I'm just going to right-click on my domain here, and I'm going to create a new host. I'm just going to call my vCenter server appliance VCSA-demo, and I'll put in the IP address for it here. And I'll go ahead and choose the option to create the associated pointer record, and I'll add my new host. And there we can see it was successfully created. And I'll also just go ahead and check here to make sure that it was actually added. There it is, VCSA-demo. And I'm also going to go to my reverse lookup zone as well and make sure that the record was added there also. And I can see that yes, it has been successfully added there too. And this is a critical step. We have to make sure that our vCenter server appliance address is added to the forward and reverse lookup zones before I start installing the vCenter server appliance. So now that I've got my DNS configuration complete, I'm just going to minimize this. And on my desktop, you can see here I have the vCenter server appliance ISO that I got from my vMug Advantage eval experience. And so I'm just going to go ahead and double click on this ISO image. And I'm going to launch the VCSA UI installer. I'm going to do it here under Win32, and here you can see installer.exe. I'll go ahead and launch the installer. And just to make sure that this is very clear, I am not installing vCenter on Windows. I have a vCenter server installer that's running on Windows, but what I'm actually doing here is I am creating a vCenter server appliance that's going to run on its own independent virtual machine. So I'm not installing vCenter on Windows. I want to make that very clear. Now, as a side note, this exact same installer can be used to upgrade an existing vCenter server appliance, or you could even migrate from an existing Windows vCenter server to a new vCenter server appliance. And you can also restore from backup. All of those tasks are done using the same installer here, the vCenter server installer. So I'm going to do a brand new installation. I'll click on install. And this begins stage 1 of the vCenter deployment process. So in stage 1, what we're doing is we're creating the virtual machine, the virtual appliance that vCenter is going to run on. So let's just click on next here, and I will accept the end user license agreement and click on next. And now I need to identify either an ESXi host or a vCenter server. And the reason I have to do this is because vCenter is going to run as a virtual machine. So I have to either target an individual ESXi host, or I have to target a vCenter server that is being used to manage multiple ESXi hosts. And in the last video, I created an ESXi host, so I'm just going to put in the IP address of that ESXi host. And of course, I also have to supply credentials for that ESXi host so that this installer will be allowed to create a new virtual machine and install the vCenter server appliance as a virtual machine running on that target host. So I've got my credentials put in. I'll go ahead and click next, and I will go ahead and accept the certificate warning. And then it wants to know, what is the name of my vCenter server appliance going to be? So I'm just going to be sure to give it the exact same name that I configured in my DNS entry. And then I'll set my root password for it as well, and I'll click on next. And then I'll go ahead and choose my deployment size. And there is a handy little chart down here that'll give you a good idea of, well, hey, if I have a tiny deployment, how many virtual CPUs am I going to get? How much memory am I going to allocate? And really, what size do I need is determined by how many hosts and how many virtual machines do I plan on running. And so I plan on running very few hosts and very few virtual machines. So in my lab configuration, a tiny is going to be just fine. But if I was going to run like 400 hosts, I would need either a medium or a large. And I would have to have more CPU and more memory dedicated to this vCenter virtual appliance. So in my environment, I'm going to go with a tiny deployment size. I'm going to leave storage size at the default and click Next. Now the next step here is to choose a data store that the vCenter server appliance can be installed on. And I have a data store available here that I created in the last video. I established a 100 gig local data store on my first ESXi host. That's going to be the data store that's going to be used to store the virtual disks and all of the other files related to my vCenter server appliance. And I am going to enable thin disk mode here. So thin disk mode is going to allow the virtual disks for the vCenter server appliance to be created in thin provisioned mode. Basically, this is going to save me a lot of space on my data store. With this setting enabled, the vCenter server appliance will only take the disk space that it truly needs in order to operate. So that's the ideal configuration for my lab environment. So I'll go ahead and click Next here. And at this screen, we're going to choose all of the network settings for my vCenter server appliance. I'm doing IP version 4, and for IP assignment, I am choosing static. And so this vCenter server appliance is going to get a static IP that I'm going to specify. I'm going to make sure that it matches whatever I configured in DNS. And then I'm going to establish the FQDN, the fully qualified domain name. And again, I need to make sure that this matches whatever I have configured in DNS. So my FQDN here is going to be vcsa-demo.lab.local. And you can see here I've configured the IP address that I'm going to use for my vCenter server appliance. I've configured the subnet mask as well. And then finally, I've put in the IP address of my default gateway and the IP address of my DNS server. So my network configuration is complete. I'll click on Next, and that'll bring me to a nice little summary page. And at this point, we are ready to complete stage 1. And so when I click Finish here, it's going to start deploying my vCenter server appliance virtual machine on the ESXi host that I have specified and on the data store that I have specified. And so, yeah, this process is going to take a little while. It's got to create the virtual machine. It's got to create all of the necessary virtual disks. So I'm actually going to pause my recording so that you don't have to wait through this entire process. And I'll resume as soon as this part is finished. Okay, so now we can see that stage 1 is complete. The vCenter server has been deployed, and now we can set up the vCenter server. So we can see here there is a URL shown on your screen. This is the URL for the VAMI, the vCenter Server Appliance Management Interface. So if we were to exit from this wizard here, we could resume this process by logging into the VAMI, and we'll take a closer look at the VAMI later on. But right now, I'm just going to click on the Continue button here. And this will bring us into stage 2 of the vCenter server appliance installation process. And so during stage 2, yeah, we're setting up the vCenter server appliance that we've just created. So I'll just go ahead and click on Next. And the first option I need to choose is a time synchronization mode. And I'm using an NTP server. So I have an NTP server that I'm using not only for my vCenter server appliance, but for all of my ESXi hosts. I want to make sure that I keep everything on the same exact time and synchronize that. So I will point my vCenter server appliance to that NTP server. And at this screen, I'm also going to enable SSH access to allow me to use an SSH tool like PuTTY, for example, to establish a command line session to this vCenter server. Now, I don't necessarily have to activate this, and in an on-premises environment in the real world, I probably want to leave this deactivated unless I plan on using it. But for my lab environment, I'm going to activate this SSH access and just go ahead and click Next here. And now I'm going to create a new single sign-on or SSO domain. And I'm just going to make my SSO domain vSphere.local. My single sign-on administrator user, the username is just going to be administrator. And I'll go ahead and establish a password for my SSO administrator. But if I already had a vCenter server that was up and running, and I already had an existing single sign-on domain, I could actually join that single sign-on domain here. And that would allow me to sign in to either one of these vCenter instances, but see the inventory of both of those vCenter servers. Now you'll notice here, it doesn't mention the platform services controller at all. And as of vSphere 7, and again also in vSphere 8, there is no external platform services controller option available. So we are not going to have any options reflecting that here in our configuration options. So I'm just going to go ahead and click Next here. And I am going to join the VMware Customer Experience Improvement Program. This is going to be important because I'm going to use this for some features that I'm going to use later on, like Skyline and some other good information that I want to have access to. So here in my lab environment, yep, I'm going to join the Customer Experience Improvement Program, and I'll click Next. And that'll bring me to a screen where I see a nice little summary of everything that I've configured. So I'm going to go ahead and just make sure everything looks good, and it does. I'm going to click Finish. It's going to tell me, hey, once you start this process, you cannot stop it. You cannot pause it. You just have to let it finish. So that's fine with me. I'm going to hit OK here. And this part's going to take a little while it runs through and completes all of the configuration of the vCenter server appliance. So I'm going to pause my recording so that you don't have to sit here and wait through that entire process. So here we can see that stage 2 of the installation process is now complete. So we're in great shape, and we've got our little getting started page here that I can click on if I want. And that will launch a web browser session and allow me to connect up to my vCenter server using the vSphere client. Now, there's no such thing as like the vSphere web client or the C# client or those older vSphere clients that you might be used to. There's one vSphere client that can connect to vCenter, and that's it. So I'm going to go ahead and click on this little vSphere client link, and it's going to present me with a login page. I'm going to log in as the SSO administrator that I created during stage 2. And the first time you go through this login process, it's going to take longer than normal, so you might need to be a little patient here. And the username that I'm going to put in is administrator at vsphere.local. vSphere.local was the single sign-on domain, or SSO domain, that I created when I was setting up my vCenter server appliance. And I also established a password for that as well, so I'll put in that password here. And so I'll just go ahead and click on login, and again, we might need to be a little patient here. The first time we launch the vSphere client, it's probably going to take longer than we would anticipate it will normally take. And here we can see it looks like the vSphere client is successfully logging in here. It told me I need to refresh my browser, so I'll go ahead and do that because certain plugins are currently being enabled. And it also tells me right at the top here in yellow, hey, I've got expired or expiring licenses. Well, I have license keys that I can use that I got from my vMug Advantage membership. So I'll go ahead and apply those license keys in a future lesson. But yeah, we can see we've got a vCenter server appliance working here. And we can see that we can navigate all of the inventory here in my vSphere client. So it looks like my vCenter 8 installation is complete and working properly.